Territory is what is within your border. That's territory. So it's space defined by a border is how I'd define territory. The territory of Margera is interesting. I can answer that two ways. The first is the obvious one, which is the water defines the border on the Venice side. The edge of Margera on the other side is a little bit more loose. But the territory of Margera, I would argue, is actually Venetian. So it's a part of, and our studio is arguing for Margera to be considered as part of Venice. So Old Venice, New Venice. So I called my studio Delirious New Venice. And the argument for that is that Margera is like a Manhattan, and we have a new city, a new site. So the territory of Margera is interesting because of that. Landscape I define landscape as anything that's unconstructed. But I'm very interested in topography as a subtle difference from landscape. And in a little bit in the workshop and certainly in my office, we look at very closely the idea of topography in the Australian condition, where the horizon and the sky are big. So the topography becomes a plane that we work above and below all the time. So that's a little bit different from landscape. But landscape I define as just anything unconstructed. The Biennale leaves the Giardini. You create a garden of some description without pavilions. You bring that to Margera to initiate, to fertilise Margera with landscape. So we selected this year a particular island and said that's an island that is a garden within which pavilions can be constructed. But the landscape of Margera is an industrial one, so it's a constructed landscape. To develop Margera, the landscape needs to be unconstructed and reconstituted with a mix of unbuilt and built. At the moment, it's completely built. And the one attempt over there to introduce landscape back into the island around the waterfront hasn't really worked because the scale is so immense that a decision to unconstruct and reconstitute landscape is a massive one. It's almost unbelievably big. So I think it's an interesting question because of that. How do you unbuild what's there and reconstitute it so that the balance is right to make it potentially a new city?
Okay.
The argument for doing that is based on the age of the students. So if these guys were older, I would happily engage with them on the scale of Margera. Because they're first years, a lot of them, first, second, third, the scale's overwhelming. For a 3-week workshop, I think it's better we spent 1 week on urban design. We talked about Margera, we talked about the Giardini, we talked about some of the forces on urban design. But then the question is, what do you continue to learn for the next 2 weeks? And I don't want the first years being swamped in a studio making models of blocks to stick on a site plan when they could be learning more about architecture. So to bring architecture into the workshop, we say, okay, you've looked at urban design issues at a big scale, both on Venice and at Porto Marghera. Now bring everything back to a scale that you actually understand in first or second or third year and talk about a building. So they get both. We don't ignore the scale of Marghera, but we also try and make it something they can handle. If I was having the same conversation with a final year, 50th year student, it would be a different conversation, because by then I would assume that they have enough comprehension of architecture to handle the scale of Marghera. So that's the reason. It's deliberate. If the students are older or postgraduate students doing urban design research, completely different. But
Okay.
with young guys, they don't know what a door or a window is yet. So we're talking about kilometres in Marghera. So I bring them back to the scale of a small building as well.
Okay.